Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is spirit depossession. We're going to look at the concept that a human being in 20th century Western culture might actually embody within themselves the spirits of departed individuals. And with me in the studio is Dr. Edith Fiore, a clinical psychologist and author of several books, including You Have Been Here Before and The Unquiet Dead, a psychologist looks at spirit depossession. Welcome, Edie.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I think it would be useful to begin our program by just reviewing the odyssey that led you from a sort of straight orthodox clinical psychologist to be working in an area that I think we would have to call very closely related to shamanistic practice.
Well, it is kind of an odyssey. I began by, of course, not believing in the concept of earthbound spirits or past lives or any of these rather esoteric subjects. And I began using hypnosis because I felt that the answers to people's problems lay in past lives. And so therefore, I wanted to get into the past lives, into the subconscious. And in delving into the subconscious, people inadvertently, it seemed, flipped into past lives. And I did not believe in past lives, so I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I stayed with the person, and lo and behold, they were relieved of their symptoms. And so I began to use hypnosis more and more. In the process of using hypnosis, people seemed to emerge that were very different from the original person. And I assumed that these were multiple personalities, and began taping it and investigating it and finding it was very fascinating and trying to integrate these personalities into the basic personality, which didn't work at all. And some of these personalities would just flip in and flip out. For instance, I remember one case years and years ago of a child that said, "How about playing hopscotch with me?" and then was gone, and I never heard from the child again. And it didn't make sense that this would be a sub-personality or a multiple personality.
Conventional hypnotherapists use the term ego states to refer to this phenomenon. It's well known amongst hypnotists.
That's right. And at any rate, after doing a little reading on the subject, I heard of the concept of earthbound spirits. And I thought, well, if they're earthbound, maybe we can get them to go. And so I started inviting them to leave and then developed some procedures for doing that. And I found that I began to get what seemed to be miracle cures in very short order by having these so-called multiple personalities leave. And so therefore I began to switch my thinking from seeing them as ego states or multiple personalities to seeing them as actual people who have lived and died and were then cohabiting with the original personality, with the original person.
And of course, that's a very ancient worldview, really. It's nothing that you invented yourself.
Certainly not.
But it's one that's been rather alien to our culture within the last several hundred years.
Well, I think that's because we're very scientifically oriented and materialistically oriented. We don't really know about whether there are such things as intangible spirits or whether we do really exist after our physical body dies. And from my work with past lives, I became convinced that we do indeed live on, and that it makes all the sense in the world that some people, instead of going into the light in the afterworld, get lost, and they remain here in the physical plane and then join up with other living people.
Well, if you look at the evidence from near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and the multitude of clinical reports from people doing past life regression work and depossession work, one senses that there are common themes that run through all of this, and it would suggest that there is another world out there, a world after death, and that there are mappable properties that it seems to have.
Exactly. Today, one of my patients was telling me about a mirror that kept dropping off, that she moved into an apartment that was built above a Hawaiian burial ground. And before they moved into the building, the manager said, there are a lot of superstitious people who are very afraid to live in the building because strange things happen. Are you superstitious? And she said no, and then moved in and all kinds of things happened. A mirror kept dropping off of the wall, makeup kept disappearing, and all of this sort of thing. And then actually her roommate saw the spirit of a woman in the room. So yes, these things are very tangible at times, just enough to be scary and to go bump in the night, and also to cause us to open up our minds a little bit.
I suppose it's fair to say that even if it's not an scientifically accepted worldview, it is a sociologically, anthropologically documentable alternative worldview that people hold. And as a psychotherapist, if you wish to operate within the parameters of that worldview and you find that you get results in therapy, then it's of pragmatic value.
I think that's exactly right. My philosophy has been, regardless of what other people believe, if it works, it works. And that's when somebody comes to me with migraine headaches that they've had for years and years, they're only interested in one thing, not whether there are such things as spirits or past lives or whatever else, but they want to get rid of their headache or their depression or whatever problem it is. And so that's my role, to help them to live healthier, happier lives and to be rid of their symptoms.
Well, let's talk a little bit now about some of the kinds of cases that you would see. I mean, I know at this point in your practice, after having done maybe 20,000 past life regressions and written one of the foremost books in the field of past life regression therapy, and then having moved into the area of depossession as a form of therapy, you now primarily work with depossession in your therapy practice.
Yes, and at the same time I am doing past lives, of course. I'm using them side by side, and sometimes there's an interweaving which we can get into later.
Yes.
Well, you asked about this type of cases.
Yeah, a typical case.
Well, when somebody comes into my office, they can present any kind of symptom, and it could run from allergies to depression to obesity or drug use or whatever. Any kind of problem that would come into a therapist's office. And I start thinking in terms of what is causing the problem, because I find that the only thing that really eliminates the symptom is to get at the cause of the problem, to go for the jugular, essentially. And so I start listening for clues in terms of what the person said to me. And if I find, for instance, that they were fine, they didn't have any problems, and then they had a hysterectomy, and following that they put on a lot of weight and started eating very differently, then I begin to think, aha, this is not a past life. This is not a trauma from the current life that's surfacing. This is an earthbound spirit, somebody they picked up in the hospital. And so that's the sort of thing that I'm aware of, that after some kind of surgical procedure or after hospitalization or whatever, symptoms begin to crop up. And so it can be any symptom, because when you're bringing somebody on board, you're bringing that person as a total person.
So you're looking for the sudden onset of unusual, uncharacteristic symptoms.
That is one clue. However, the person could have been like that, quote, all of their lives, which means that they could have picked this person up when they had their tonsillectomy at age 3, or when they were very sick, or when they went to so-and-so's funeral when they were little, and so that they remember back and they feel that they've always been this way.
Well, I would think, if we're talking about this notion of being possessed by spirits, that while it's a concept that is given no credence in our normal secular culture, that if you were to, well, amongst our viewers, for example, probably a high percentage of them might pause and think, gee, I wonder if I'm possessed.
Yes, exactly. I think that one of the things that I hear over and over again in an interview that is the most outstanding clue is the feeling of, that's just not me. I did that, but that's not the way I am, really. And that other people will say that I'm acting out of character when I'm this way or that way. And so the person even gets validation from a spouse or from friends that they have, that this is uncharacteristic of them. But down deep is that inner knowingness that there's something wrong, there's an alienation that just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they can actually become aware, because it's going on all the time, but usually they're not aware of it, of a little inner dialogue, a little argument. For instance, I'm going to start a diet. Oh, no, you're not. I want that ice cream. And then, no, you know that it isn't good to have ice cream when you start a diet, and so forth and so on. And that goes on, that chatter goes on all the time, but the person who is having this problem doesn't realize that there's anything wrong with it. They haven't made the connection that it's somebody else. Then when they become aware that maybe there is somebody there, then they begin to become much more aware of these clues that have been there all along, maybe for years and years and years. You asked me about cases earlier, and I think that this is a very excellent case, and it's sort of like one of my most fascinating in many ways. It's the case of a woman named Wendy who came in at age 32, and she came in presenting symptoms of great depression that she'd had for 20 years, including not being hospitalized, but just short of it. Antidepressants off and on for 20 years, seeing many psychiatrists, having lots of different forms of therapy, and nothing working at all. 2 suicidal attempts, one as a teenager and one following her divorce. And this apparently started when she was 12 years old. And along with that was a very stubborn smoking habit. And she was smoking 3 packs a day and didn't like it at all. And she felt like she was out of control, that her life didn't have any meaning.
This sounds like the kind of case that a lot of therapists would say not to expect much progress, but just that someone's like this would need continual long-term therapy, mostly for maintenance.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing is that I saw Wendy a total of 3 sessions, and then a 4th one much later just to work on a completely different problem. In the first session, I had a 50-minute session with her, and I immediately got the picture that there was somebody else on board because of the things that she said. This depression had come on suddenly when she was 12 years old. Up until that time, she had been a very happy girl, doing very well in school, came from a very happy, well-oriented, a family that was just very supportive and happy, a very good family. And she had a lot of extracurricular activities as well. She was just a very well-rounded, well-liked girl. Then she got sick with bronchitis, and following that, her whole personality changed. Her mother had commented to her about this because she couldn't remember that too well. She did very poorly in school, barely got through college, and dropped out of all her extracurricular activities and became very introverted. And at the age of 12, as soon as she got over her bronchitis, she started sneaking cigarettes. And as soon as she could, she was smoking heavily. And by the age of 15, if I remember correctly, she was smoking 3 packs a day, at which she continued until I saw her. Now, since she had attempted suicide, and since this had all come on suddenly after this illness, she was not hospitalized, I began to suspect that she had brought on board a suicidal entity, someone who had actually killed him or herself. Fortunately, in that session, I was able to make some contact with that person and did a depossession, which just stirred the person up, and there was great crying and that sort of thing. But fortunately, I had another appointment scheduled for her the next day. And she came in, and at that point I was able to reach this person who was a man and convince him to go, and he left. He went with loved ones into the light. She came back 1 month later and reported that her symptoms completely were eliminated as of that moment that she left my office. She no longer she didn't have the slightest urge to smoke cigarettes. She hadn't gained an ounce, and there wasn't a trace of depression. And all kinds of interesting things happened. For example, when she tried to get into a pair of pants that she had been wearing for years, she just couldn't put them on. It just didn't feel right. So she had to get rid of about 1/3 of her wardrobe. It was sort of a unisex type of wardrobe, that part. She brought in 2 checkbooks a month later. The first one was of pastel drawings of clipper ships with some sunglasses on top that she laid on top, and they were sort of the aviator type glasses. The other checkbook, which is her current checkbook, was pastel flowers with very feminine sunglasses, just to show me the ways that this person, this male entity, had been affecting her. At that point, we did a regression to the moment when he joined her, and what we found is that when she was sick with bronchitis, she was very weakened. Her aura, the electromagnetic force field around her, was apparently very weakened because of her illness. And the doctor who came to make a home call brought this spirit along with him. The spirit had tried to get into his aura. Actually, some of this came out during the second session, but the doctor was too well protected and strong. But he came along, seeing the doctor as a helper, and then just stayed with Wendy and incorporated. And from that point on, was ruining Wendy's life and her happiness.
Now, perhaps we should back up a little bit and just refer to some of the terms that you have used, entity, spirit. How do you conceive of a spirit or an entity being able to do this, to in effect exist in three-dimensional space and time like that, to jump from one body to another?
Well, let me just say this. First of all, I'm talking about a person who has lived and died. I'm not talking about some kind of entity that is of a different dimension, for instance, a demonic or satanic entity. I'm not involved with that at all. There's no way that I can deal with that or can help someone with that problem. So these are people like a grandparent or a stranger, somebody who has lived and died, just regular folk. And for some reason, their personality, or in some way their personality, continues exactly as they were at the moment of their death, as long as they're earthbound. The usual progression is for them, of course, to go into the light, and we can talk about that if you wish. But they don't do this. They stay earthbound for a multitude of reasons. And they hover around very much as they were, exactly as they were before, but lacking the physical body. Because you see, you know that we are spirits living in a physical vehicle, a body, and that is not who we are. So when the body dies, it's just like an old overcoat, and we continue to exist. And hopefully we go up into the light and into the spirit world, where we drop away all the concerns and problems and depressions or whatever. But if the person remains earthbound, in other words, I feel it's in the physical plane. Some people call it the lower astral plane, but I see it as really the physical plane. Then they are there as an invisible spirit.
I mean, in other words, these, to your way of thinking, these entities or spirits are like some sort of energy matrix.
Yes. They do not have a body or a very well-organized body of their own at that point.
You might think of it like a holographic standing wave or something.
Right. Well, actually, they're sometimes seen as ghosts.
Yeah.
This is really what we're talking about, with ghosts, with a common word.
Well, I realize you don't pretend to be some kind of a scientist who can give us a theoretical explanation.
No.
You're describing this as a clinical psychologist.
That's right. And I haven't done research into this, and I am really, the theoretical part of it doesn't interest me. It interests me, but I don't feel like the great expert in that area. I do know, I feel, what to do when a person has this problem. That's my area of expertise. And how it all happens is not all that clear to me. But my feeling is that they remain in the physical world as invisible spirits, bringing with them all the pain and suffering or whatever they experience at the moment of their death. And they remain for many reasons. They remain because of their addictions to substances, for instance, food, chocolate, coffee even, drugs of all kinds, alcohol, cocaine, heroin. They are so determined, nicotine of course, they're so determined to continue that habit that they would rather not experience, they don't even know about the light because they're so focused on getting their next cigarette or their next fix or whatever. So they remain for that reason. They sometimes remain, I think usually they remain because they're totally confused and they don't realize that they are no longer alive in their own body. They feel alive, they're still thinking, they're still seeing, they're still smelling perhaps. And so they assume that they are still in their body. And they don't want to look down and face it, there's not much there, or they don't want to face that corpse over there. And so they run over to their family or the doctors and nurses and they try to get help, only to find that their hand goes through them or that nobody's paying the least bit of attention. And this is very, very confusing to them and very frightening and at times extremely frustrating.
So, to jump around just a moment, you've used the term the light several times. Let's talk about that end of the phenomenon.
Well, it appears that the normal progression is that when somebody dies, that their spirit lifts up away from the physical body, and they have a wonderful sense of relief as they're heading toward this light that is described almost universally by my patients doing regressions to a former death experience, by people who have had clinical deaths and been revived and so forth. This is almost universally seen as a brilliant white light, blinding but not hurting the eyes, in which when they get into this light, they feel very loved and accepted, exactly as they are. If they were depressed, that drops away. If they were in physical pain, it drops away. If they were hungry, it drops away. They're just feeling wonderful in every way. And then from that, I think that's sort of like the entry into the spirit world. There are usually lots of loved ones there. If somebody whom they love died before they they did, then that person is there to greet them, if not even before, to help them to get into the light. So it seems to be a universally experienced situation. Even when people have not read about the light, they say, I see a little pinpoint of light, it's getting bigger and so forth, and now I feel wonderful.
Well, I know it's described classically in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and
Yes.
there is a sense in that book that if one can stay focused on the light and move into it at the point of death without being distracted by the many distractions that
Yes.
one would find, then one could escape from the wheel of life and the wheel of rebirth and enter into the realm of a pure Buddha or Bodhisattva. But otherwise, there will be temptations drawing one into various rebirths. And I suppose the very first temptation might be for the earthbound types that you've described, who are so involved in their own attachments and addictions that they may never even notice the light to begin with.
They usually don't notice the light. Sometimes they're afraid of the light if they have seen it, because they're afraid of going to hell. This is a big fear. This is another reason why people stay. If they've been raised with this concept and they believe this concept, then they're terrified because they did something while they were alive that will catapult them straight into hell. So they would much rather cling to what they consider a safe harbor. And so part of the depossession process is to undo that belief, or to try to convince them that they do not have to be concerned about hell.
So in your work, you find a high percentage of the people who come to see you who seem to be possessed. And I want to ask you, do you think it's because a high percentage of people in the population are that way, or is it because you recognize it more than others, or is it perhaps just part of the symbolic system within which you work?
I really think that it is just generally in the population in general. I think that most people in their lives have been possessed at one time or another. So I'm beginning to now think that it's a sort of 100%. This doesn't mean that 100% of the time one is possessed, but it means that I don't think anybody escapes from this, because there are literally thousands and thousands of opportunities. Now, just to get into theory again, and other people's viewpoints, Sai Baba, the holy man in India, feels that we are always being possessed, that spirits are coming and going through us all the time. Now, this isn't exactly what I find. I don't think that they can just come and go willy-nilly. What I find is that there have to be special situations. In other words, some people are protected, and they're not intruded upon at various times in their life. When the aura is weakened, that opens the door, and then anybody can come on board. Now, it could be that that isn't really the case, that the person who comes on board is someone with whom the person has had links from past lives, and that there's a karmic thing going on board, that there are things to be worked out. But that gets extremely theoretical, and usually it is not necessary to go into that kind of level of understanding in order to solve the problem.
But it must be a very delicate process, I'm sure, distinguishing between our own thoughts
Yes.
that we have, the normal conversation that everybody has, and thoughts that may intrude on us somehow, that are not ours.
Well, that is why it's so unrecognized, and why people can come in and not suspect for a moment that they have somebody else on board, because it feels like themselves. And even if they are not acting uncharacteristically, if that is not the problem, if they just, for instance, have headaches because perhaps the spirit who is possessing them got killed in a car accident and had damage to his or her head, still they can't tell that there's anybody on board, because the few little thoughts that go rattling through their mind seem so familiar. That's exactly the problem. And interestingly enough, even after working with somebody as a patient week after week after week, and they see progress in some areas, they're still fooled. They think, well, I thought I was free totally. Maybe we have removed 10 or 15, and they think, well, I thought I got the last one to go. And yet all of a sudden somebody else emerges who is really causing the problem.
Well, let's talk now about how you do depossession.
Fine. Okay, there are three major points to make. First of all, the general thing that I do is to convince the earthbound spirit to leave. I give a little analogy. It's as though you have somebody sitting in a room sort of like this. And
I'm not going.
I'm not going. And let's say that I can't come in and physically drag you out of the room, nor can I call any heavyweights in from the spirit world or anywhere else to drag you out. So there's only one way for me to get you saying, I am not going, when you've dug in your heels and you're not budging, to get you to go through that door and leave, and that is to talk you into going, to convince you to be the best salesperson I can and to be the most convincing and to get you to leave. Now, I feel that I have an obligation to this earthbound spirit, that actually my first obligation, believe it or not, is to that person.
Rather than to the client.
Exactly. Because if we relieve the client of the possession or the possessor, now that person is freed and doesn't have headaches, doesn't have this or that symptom. But now we have a monstrous problem because we still have this lost soul who doesn't have a chance to get into the light, or at least they've missed that chance. And they may not get another chance to get into the light. And they may just incorporate with somebody else who never gets help. And if it's a suicidal entity, that person could end up killing themselves. And if it isn't a suicidal type of situation, let's say it's just somebody who has an obsession with chocolates or whatever, still, this person could go on possessing one after the other person, even through their deaths, and just continue in a sort of a chain reaction. So I feel this is the golden opportunity to help this lost soul to get into the light. So I see that as my job. And even if I have to ask the patient, hang in there a little longer with this spirit, and they say, no, no, it hurts, and I'll convince them to do that because our first obligation is to this lost soul. So the obvious thing then is to be extremely persuasive. They must be, first of all, convinced that their own body has died, but that does not mean that they've died, because obviously they're not the least bit dead, because they're listening to me and they're very alive and they're tasting the food, or they're doing this or that or whatever they're doing.
And I gather they have to feel persuaded that you're on their side.
Yes.
That you're trying to help them, not just boot them out.
Okay. I never try to boot them out. I learned the hard way that that doesn't work, number one. And number two, I feel like it's just not my personality to get forceful and dictatorial and to order them to leave. So that since it doesn't work, and since it's not my personality, I don't use that technique. I tried it in sort of dire situations, and it just doesn't work. I mean, I would bring in archangels, and I'd bring in Jesus, and I'd bring in this one and that one, and still they'd budge. And now I've lost my power, because I have now used force against force, and they've won, and now I don't have any credibility with them. So years ago, I gave up that approach, and instead I am there as their helper, and I try to understand where they're at. And so I try to be as compassionate as possible and to try to understand where they're coming from. I'll give you an example of a case, because I think it will show you how I work. I was working with a person today who, even though she has been working with me for many months and knows all about earthbound spirits because she's seen some good changes in herself, came in saying that she felt very discouraged about the therapy. She felt she was hopeless. She was very depressed, but then she remembered that it's strange, she hadn't been depressed any of the days since our last session a week ago except today. And she woke up this morning feeling depressed and hopeless and thought that she would end the therapy and whatever. And I pointed out to her that this was someone else. And she is one of the ones who said, well, I thought we got them all. And I pointed out to her that this is, I've heard this from her before. And she has a problem with her weight, and she had gained 3 pounds since the last time, and so forth and so on. So what I found was that this person felt that there was no hope, there were no miracle cures, that this was hocus pocus, these are all her words, that she was hopeless, that she would always be like this, and she might as well gut through it in life and just not have any help, not have the chiropractor, not have me, not have any help whatsoever.
In other words, she was sort of resigned to living life in a sort of a hopeless state.
Yes. And then she said, but I don't understand why, because really everything's going beautifully in my life. And I pointed out to her, look, you have an earthbound spirit with you who feels this way, and you're just buying their thoughts as your own. And then the light began to turn on in her eyes, and she said, well, that is true, because everything is fine, and I didn't feel like this. I felt wonderful the last few days since our last session. And then I just got some inspiration. I said, well, what about suicide? This person really sounds like the kind of person that was being so hopeless that he or she would want to commit suicide. Maybe they did. So how about you? Have you had any thoughts about it? And she said, well, yes. And I said, well, what have you thought about it? She said, well, by the way, my neck is bothering me. And I said, oh, well, then I thought maybe the spirit had hanged him or herself. And I said, well, how would a person kill themselves that would involve the neck? So she said, well, hanging. But she said, I said, well, did that ever occur to you to hang yourself? She said, never. And she said, then she thought of it and she said, but what did occur to me was to drive my car into a cement abutment. And I said, aha, well, you certainly, if that happened, you would break your neck right away, wouldn't you? And she said, yes. And I said, well, how many times have you thought of that? And she said, oh, a couple hundred.
Just that day?
Yeah, just like that. No, not that day, just in general. And she said when she was divorcing her first husband, it was particularly bad. She was thinking about it all the time. So then I asked her, how far back, she said, whenever I get in a car, I think about it. And I asked her, how far back have you thought about it? And she said, even when she first began to drive. So that told me that she had had this spirit on board since she was about 15 or 16 years old. See, this is the way I was able to piece this whole thing together. Now, since she had a weight problem, she weighs 170, and she should be weighing about 115 or 20. One of her problems is compulsive overeating. I started to think about this person, and then she said, I was asking, well, what about this person? I mean, how does this person feel about this? And then she said, she thinks there's a lot of she thinks you can't help her, and there's a lot of hocus pocus. I said, oh, it's a woman. And then I said, you know, I bet that this woman was so fat that she felt that no one would ever love her, and tears welled up and started streaming down. So now I had reached, this is what I mean by a compassionate approach. So then I talked to the person, the spirit, and I said, you know, you do feel hopeless and you feel I can't help you, and that's exactly the way you felt before. And I'm sure you did drive your car into the abutment, didn't you? And the head started nodding yes. And I said, well, you know, you did that for one reason, and that was to end your pain. And you could have if you'd gone into the light. Not that I'm suggesting that that was the correct solution, but once you'd done that, you could have gone into the light. But by remaining earthbound, you have perpetuated the very thing that you wanted to escape from. And then I could see I could see the wheels moving. So that is what I mean by being persuasive. And of course, this spirit did realize that her body had already died, but I tried to reach her and I said, essentially that there were loved ones and that when she got into the light she would be slender and she could eat as much as she wanted to and her body wouldn't get fat and so forth. And so we did a brief brief depossession. I don't think that she left this time, but I think now she's geared up to leave, and I think that next time she will leave. So the major points are, to get back to how I do this, is one, to help the person to realize that their own body is dead, because that is a big stumbling block. Generally speaking, many of them don't realize that. Two, that they have loved ones who've come from the spirit world. Now, if they actually see their loved ones, even if they don't believe their body is dead, they will almost automatically go immediately with their loved ones. They don't even try to figure it out. If they realize their body is dead but they don't see their loved ones, even though I'm convinced that they're there, then they're reluctant to go because they're going all by themselves into an unknown situation. So then it's incumbent on me to convince them that their loved ones are there, and to try to figure out who their loved ones would be. If it's an elderly woman, then maybe her husband is there. If it's a child, it's usually very easy that there's a grandparent there, and then children are usually quite obedient and will go. So that's the second point. The third is, since so many of us have been brought up with the concept of hell, is to convince the person that there's no such thing as hell. And so I tell them that there are spiritual teachers who've come who are assuring them that there's no hell. And so then once that has been accomplished, then I do just a little ritual.
And you find that by suggesting the presence of loved ones and this presence of these spiritual teachers, that perhaps at, let's say, the astral plane level, they appear.
They do, and it seems, because many of these patients become clairvoyant, and they will say, I saw her leaving with her mother, or yes, the teachers were there. He was bearded, or he was this, that, or the other thing, or was a nun, or it was a priest. Also, if I feel the person would really respond to a medical doctor, I'll say, there's a doctor here who wants to take care of you, if the person has been sick. Or if it's a young teenage boy, I might say, there's a beautiful young woman here, and then he'll sort of perk up and start smiling through the patient. And whoever I want to have come, comes, it seems. Very rarely do they say, no, there's no teenage girl here. If it's a very kind of blustery guy who is a great drinker and womanizer, and he's made that clear, then I'll say, hey, there's a gorgeous blonde here, and then he'll immediately leave. But going into the light. And I feel that I can call these people, that this is all being orchestrated by helping spirits of a very higher echelon who will bring in exactly who needs to come.
In other words, as you do this work in depossession, you've got some help yourself on the other side.
Yes, I am now I do not see these helpers,
Yeah.
and I don't have any great overt communication with them. I'm not consciously aware
But
of them.
there is a sense of partnership there.
I feel that there has to be.
Yeah.
The detective in me says that there has to be all this help, that I couldn't be doing it this easily myself and get the inspirations that I get. So I ask for help before I begin working in the day.
Well, you know, I must say, since you've introduced me to this work, which has now been some years, in my own practice, I have felt that as well. It may be an illusion that I carry,
Yes.
but it seems to be a powerful illusion that
yes.
there is this help available. And minimally speaking, it gives me enough confidence to kind of work my way through the process as well. And it seems to be contagious to the extent that my patients as well seem to notice these things.
Yes, and actually it's a very easy process in most cases. In some cases it's practically, well, I won't say impossible, but it can be very tricky and very stubborn.
Yeah.
But in about 90% of the cases, these earthbound spirits will go very readily. And I've had some confirmation because, as I mentioned, some of my patients are clairvoyant. A lot of them are extremely psychic. And they will tell me that they see people standing in back of me, working with me, or they'll see a whole row of people sitting on chairs that aren't there in the office, watching all of this, or they'll see a nurse and a doctor coming. In other words, they'll see all these things happening. And so that has given me confidence through the years that all I have to do is to say there's a priest here and there's a priest here, or there's a healer and there's a healer, or whatever. Or there are 3 or 4 relatives. And whatever I seem to want is what at least some of them say that they see. So this makes me think that I don't have to worry about whether this is a figment of my imagination or not.
So the art of depossession then seems to be the art of gently leading the possessing spirit to accompany spirit guides or relatives or helpers into the light.
That's exactly it. That's what it boils down to.
Uh-huh.
And to use whatever bit of ingenuity, whatever we can do to convince them to go. To use any thought that comes into your mind that makes sense. Like if they love to eat chocolate, to tell them that their loved one is holding up a box of See's candy or their very favorite candies. If they're alcoholics, to say, well, look, your loved one is holding up the bottle of bourbon or your very favorite drink. In other words, and then to know that that is being done.
Now, sometimes it occurs, I have experienced, and I'm sure you have, where the possessing entity will sort of cajole you along a little bit and promise to leave, but
Yes.
then not really.
Yes, another tricky thing they do is they leave and actually leave the body and the aura, in which case the person has complete alleviation of the symptoms, only to come back a few days later and all the symptoms come back. But this, I point out to the patient, is simply the person leaving and staying in the physical plane and then not going into the light. They would never ever come back from the light. Then when they come back on board, then usually they're very easy to work with. And also the patient can understand this process because they have seen the depossession, they feel complete relief, and then when it comes back, they wonder what in the world happened. I explain to them that the spirit came on board, it makes all the sense in the world. This happens from time to time, not too often.
Now, if you were going to do a depossession in a general sense, like a cleansing for anybody, this could be done even in a way that our viewers could participate
Definitely,
in it.
yes. In my book, I've mentioned that I've given a verbatim account of a depossession, verbatim instructions, and exactly word for word what to say, not using hypnosis. The only reason I use hypnosis is so that the patient can be a little bit more perceptive than they ordinarily would be. But the average person can do this on themselves, make a tape for themselves or for anybody else.
Can we go through that now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right, let's just assume that you've come into my office, Jeffrey, and that I'm just going to do my generalized depossession. Let's say I don't know whether it's your mother who's possessing you or a friend, or I have no idea. I'm just doing a generalized one, and actually I do this with every new patient. I make a tape, but instead of doing the induction, the hypnotic induction, we'll just start from so. I would ask you to monitor very carefully the reactions that you feel, and I'm going to speak to any earthbound spirits who are with you. You're here with Jeffrey, but you're not Jeffrey Mishlove, are you? That's not your name, is it? You're somebody else completely different. You have a different name, different personality, different likes and dislikes. You may even be a woman, and if you are, it must be very, very hard for you to be trapped in a male body. And even if you're a male, it must be very hard for you to be in Jeffrey's body, because you're not really living your own life, are you? You have to do what Jeffrey wants to do. You have to go to Jeffrey's office, you have to be here, for instance, doing this, and you may not have wanted to do this at all. So you don't get to really live, you're just existing. But I want you to think back to the very last time you were in your own body. Maybe it was in a hospital someplace. Maybe you were going in for surgery, or you'd had an accident. Or maybe it wasn't in the hospital. Maybe you were in a car or you were at home. See if you remember back. And then something happened to that body, didn't it? And it died. And there you were, very much alive outside of the dead body. You see, you are an eternal being and you will always be alive. Only the body dies. And at that moment, you should have gone directly into the spirit world. You would have gone into a beautiful white light. And your loved ones from the spirit world would have either come to escort you into the light, or they would have met you in the light. And from that point on, you would have been living a very full, rich, happy life in a perfect body of your own. Never alone, but always with your loved ones, your family, your friends. But instead, you made a very, very serious mistake. You remained here in the physical world without a body of your own, and you became what we call a lost soul, sort of a displaced person. Now, perhaps you didn't realize that your own body had died, and so you went up to your family, the doctors, the nurses, you tried to communicate with them, only to find that they totally ignored you. It's not that they were ignoring you, it's that you are an invisible spirit, and they just didn't know that you were there. And I'm sure that that was confusing and frightening and maybe even frustrating at times. Now, at one point, you joined Jeffrey. Up until then, you were just harming yourself, but from that point on, you have been hurting him as well. The least that you do is to drain him of some of his energy, and the most is to totally confuse him so that he doesn't know his thoughts from yours, his impulses from yours, his reaction from your reactions. And this isn't fair for you to do this to him. Now, you wouldn't have wanted anyone to have done this to you, would you? Certainly not. So this is a very bad situation. It's bad for you and it's bad for him because you're trapped in his body. You're hurting him. He's being hurt. So we're going to have to get help. And fortunately, there is help here. Someone has come from the spirit world, a loved one of yours, who is absolutely overjoyed to see you. Perhaps there's more than one. They have big smiles on their faces. Now, when they died, you thought you would never see them again. And they're coming over now and they're putting their arms around you. And there may only be one person here or more than one. And you can just feel the love coming through their embrace. And now they're holding your hands. I want you to notice how very real and solid their hands are. They're in their spirit bodies, which are just as real and solid as their physical body once was. And so in a few moments when you leave Jeffrey, you're going to go into that beautiful white light over there, and you will find yourself within a matter of seconds in a perfect body of your very own. Now, if you're a male, you'll find yourself in a youthful, strong, handsome male body. If you're a female, you'll find yourself in a youthful, beautiful female body. And this will be a body that will never be diseased or damaged, injured in any way. It won't even age, and it will not die. But best of all, it's your rightful body to use as long as you need to, because it's not right for you to use Jeffrey's body. Now, before you leave, I want you to know that there's no such thing as hell, despite what you may believe. And I've called in teachers who are specialists in religious education from the spirit world to help you to understand that you have nothing to fear. Now, if you were raised as a Catholic, there's a nun or priest here, or if you're a Protestant, a minister of your own denomination. Or if you're a Jew, a rabbi is here. Whomever you need is here to help you to understand you have nothing to fear. There's no hell. There's just a beautiful life waiting for you. Now, I'm going to ask Jeffrey to mentally forgive you for any harm that you've caused him. If there are bonds of love and caring between you and Jeffrey, know that you're just a thought apart. And actually, after you've been in the spirit world a while, you can come back and be a very big help to him as a guide or just a visitor. You can give him warnings, you can give him help, advice. If there's no particular connection between you and Jeffrey, know that you'll each just go your own way. Now you're going to be going in just a few moments, but you have created some bad marks on your record by possessing Jeffrey, by hurting Jeffrey, and you can undo these bad marks by looking around and helping anyone else to leave who is here, who may not be ready to go. I want you to take that person firmly by the wrist or hand and hand them over to their loved ones or the helpers who are here. There are helping spirits here, there are healers, there are rescue workers, and these are especially trained people who see to it that you and everybody else goes into the light. So hand them over to the rescue workers or their loved ones or the other helpers. Now if someone is putting up a fuss, I want you to be very firm. Use your strength. If maybe even two of you need to help that person. And just pull if need be. Use force. And even if they're very, very upset, know that the moment that they get into the light, they will bless you. And this is the greatest service that you can perform for another person, because you're really saving a soul. It's even better than saving their life. Now by doing this, it means that in the future, in a future life, you will not have to be possessed yourself. You're undoing that need. So therefore you're helping yourself and you're helping them, and of course you're helping Jeffrey. And now it's time for you to go, and I'm going to say a blessing. Regardless of your religious beliefs, know that the vibrations from the words that I speak raise your vibrations and make it very much easier for you to leave. So go now in the name of the Father, and the Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, going in peace and light and love, leaving now, going now. And now, Jeffrey, just as a matter of interest, did you notice anything?
Well, I can say that I feel much lighter.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Maybe we...
I do. It's like taking a little shower on the inside or something.
Good. Well, it's very easy for people to pick up other people, spirits, and you know, people who are psychic are particularly vulnerable. It's as though they're a magnet. Or people in the healing arts, doctors, nurses, therapists, because spirits come to us expecting to be helped, and then before they know it, they've incorporated.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other side of that, too, is people who are attached, and maybe a good friend of theirs is departed, or a loved one.
Yes, definitely. Family member. And then there's a collusion that goes on. I'm sure you've found this in your own practice, that, for instance, let's say a daughter loses her mother, and she's been very, very close. She may really inadvertently, at a conscious level, give that mother permission to be on board. And then really, sometimes the major therapy is in getting that the client or patient to release the earthbound spirit rather than vice versa. The spirit may want to go and finds themselves tied because the person doesn't want to give the other one up.
So there's a real difference now between the concept of a spirit guide and a possessing spirit.
Oh yes, yes. A spirit guide would never enter the aura of the person or the body, and they would be there as a helper, and they're highly evolved. And they also are coming from a different dimension. They're not earthbound at all. This is a completely different cup of tea.
And what about some of the difficult cases where, for example, it may not be a loved one who is possessing, but maybe there's some kind of a karmic connection, a past life connection, or maybe even a revenge motive for a possessing?
That can be. It could be that if after I've done the routine depossessions and then I do some specialized one and I do it over and over and over, week after week, if there's no relief, if the person refuses to go or they're playing tricks or whatever, and if what I generally do at that point is I do a regression to the moment that the entity came on board, because then we have more information. We know the circumstances and I can address the entity better. I can say, well, when you were in Massachusetts General Hospital, when you were there, something happened and you died and you joined so-and-so 25 years ago. And this is now 1988. So I do that first. Then if that doesn't work, I will actually do a regression to the death of the entity. And it's as though the patient can tap into their mind, their subconscious mind. And so we'll find out that they died in a car crash, or they died in a heart attack, or they died during surgery. Then that helps me to confront the person. Your body died. Remember when you were in the car? Remember they died, or remember the surgery, or whatever. That's just these are techniques to just make the generalized depossession easier, or make it effective. If none of that works, then we have to get into a little heavier duty type of psychotherapy with the entity and that, or the patient. And that is I then look at the bond as a symptom, the bond between the possessee and the possessor. And so I go into whatever number of past lives are necessary to get out this bond. And the technique I would use is, after doing a standard induction, I would ask the patient to go to the very event that was responsible for the bond that's causing the possession. And then we would find that they were lovers in a past life, or that one had helped the other and more or less felt that they owed them a debt, or they maybe hated each other and one had killed the other and they were going to get revenge. And interestingly enough, the revenge could be by possessing someone or keeping someone earthbound incorporated by not releasing them. Now, if doing that, and maybe we have to go into a number of these past lives that have caused this bond, and it's never from the current life, it's always from a past life, then if that doesn't work, then the next level would be to get to the karmic event. In other words, working with the patient to find out why they feel at a deep level within themselves that they deserve to be possessed. What set this in motion? Now, I don't feel that this is their karma at this point, because otherwise they could not be liberated from the possession. I think it's maybe, but it seems a little far-fetched to think that their karma stopped the moment they walked in my office. But I think that there's a sustaining or perpetuating factor, that even though they may have paid off the karma in a past life, that they down deep feel that they still need to be possessed, that they're not good.
In other words, they've developed a bad habit.
Well, it's a bad, down deep they feel guilty, and they feel that they deserve this. So that then in that case, now this is an example that I had last week in going and tracking this back. We found that the person had deliberately possessed 30 people, one after the other, and driven them crazy. And then as soon as they would go into the insane asylum, it would scoot away from the person, but by then they were locked up and no one would believe that they were sane.
Sounds like a form of vampirism almost.
It is, except instead of sucking the vital force, they would just take over the body and do tricks. And this one was a very malicious person in that lifetime, and ruined about 30 lives, and probably had to be possessed and have their life ruined about 30 or so times, and now was a wonderful person in this lifetime, and was really suffering and didn't understand why any of this was happening. So, and then after that, then usually there is no need for the person to be possessed, and the entity is either gone when they come back for the next session, or will readily go.
In other words, if a person discovers that, as they look at some of the onus that they're carrying in their present life, that maybe in a past life they did something terrible, that they have to come to forgive themselves for what it was that they may have, or they believe themselves to have done in a past life.
I don't find that it's necessary for them to forgive themselves. A lot of people do feel this. It happens. The moment they look at it, the charge is gone from the memory. They don't have to go through even an act of forgiving. They don't have to go through an act of even believing that it happened.
Just a question of looking at it.
Dealing with it. They feel that by just remembering it. In other words, they may think, oh, I made that up. I couldn't have been an executioner, or I couldn't have possessed 30 people. And yet, isn't it remarkable that now the spirit goes? But they don't have to say, I was a bad guy and I forgive myself. If they need to do that, that's fine. But I always see that as the frosting on the cake. It's not at all necessary. So I don't get into any rituals of forgiving oneself in my work.
I mean, I know in my own work, I lived through a past lifetime under regression in which I was a petty tyrant, a Japanese warlord, and ruled by cruelty. And first time I went through that, I felt, oh, well, yes, good, now I understand, now I've experienced it, I can kind of let go of it. But recently I've been listening to the tape again, a second time and a third time, and I realize each time that I hear that tape, I understand it at a deeper level, and I think I'm really able to accept it, to bring it into my heart, to forgive myself more from, I guess, dealing with it more. One session is not necessarily enough.
And that's why this is called really a spiritual healing, psychotherapy, healing of the psyche, the soul, because it's a very spiritual type of therapy. Because it gets at the deepest levels.
Well, I liked the concept that you used in the beginning in describing your work. You go for the jugular.
Yes.
There is a sense, reminds me of an interview I did not too long ago with Rollo May, the existential psychotherapist who would have nothing at all to do with any of this
I'm sure of it.
spiritual work. But his point was that in psychotherapy, you want to be able to travel to hell and back with your clients, and that is in effect what you're doing.
Well, for some it is a very scary and very difficult procedure because they have to look at themselves. For one thing, they may find themselves being gang raped in past lives or being executed or murdered. They may have to look at all of these traumatic events, or they may have to find themselves doing all of those things. And because if this has been done to them, then we can always go back and find an earlier lifetime in which they did this to somebody else.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not generally necessary, but if we want to, when somebody comes with a host of symptoms, we can eliminate those symptoms by going to the past lives or getting the entities to leave or whatever. But then for them to do what I call a fine-tuning, a real kind of personal analysis, they get into the kind of thing that you did with listening to the tape again and again, getting into why they had to set all these things into motion, going to the life in which they were the worst that they've ever been. Because then they can get rid of all the deep-seated self-hatred or negativity or feelings of I don't deserve, and then they start blossoming, and all the creativity comes out, they become a positive magnet, attracting to themselves just the right opportunities, just the right people, just the right books, just the right conversations. Their whole life changes.
So they're ultimately, regardless of whether you accept what might seem to be a spiritualistic or a theosophical worldview, or whether you approach this as a pure existential phenomenologist, there's a sense in which the real therapeutic process involves, I guess, a healing of the heart.
A healing of the heart, a healing of the psyche. It's very hard to know exactly what happens. It's like if you take an aspirin and your headache goes away, we really don't know, or if you have shock therapy and you get over to depression. I think that what's happened is they've driven out the spirits who come back later, and that's why often that doesn't hold for long.
Yeah.
But at any rate, what actually happens in the healing process is beyond me. I don't understand it. I know what to do, generally what to expect, but what really, really happens inside is another thing, because it's fascinating. In Milan, Italy, there's a group of people who are trained to look within themselves and to do what we would call past life readings.
Yes.
So that if you come in with a headache, they would tell you, for example, that you died in an earthquake and something hit your head. Now, if they are right, you're going to leave there free of your headaches. And you may think it's the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard of, but isn't that interesting? You don't have your headaches any longer. Or you may cry, or you may think, yeah, that makes sense. You don't have to have an emotional reaction. You don't even have to accept it. And yet if they're right, and how do we know that they're right? Well, so many times the headache will go away that working backwards, I assume that they're right. Now, example of that.
We're running out of time.
Okay, all right, okay.
Well, go ahead, finish the example.
Oh, the example was a man who was fainting, and he saw all kinds of specialists, and the reader told him that he had been on a tightrope, and there was some noise from the audience, and he fell to his death. And once told that, he never fainted again, by just being told.
Ye shall know the truth,
Yes,
and the truth shall set you free.
Exactly.
So there's some element to that, in addition to all the other mysteries we've been dealing with. Well, Dr. Edith Fiore, thank you so much for being with me.
It has been a pleasure, Jeffrey. I've really enjoyed it.
Great. And thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much.